Hello and welcome. On today's program, we're excited to get to talk with John Loacker. He's the third generation owner of the Kroll Map Company, an important firm based in Seattle, rooted all the way back to the 1870s. And I couldn't resist asking him, one of the first questions was, what do you still have from the old stuff? What do you have from different iterations of the company over time that's still in the vault?
Guys, the oldest, and I have no idea, it was most likely transcribed. There's a 1860, there's a person named Gibbs who had something to do with delineating where the native tribes were. And so it's an original tracing of that, but it may not be, quote unquote, the original. And that's part of the thing I wanted to convey to you is that, you know, a lot of this business and other businesses like us started because we had good drafters or that could transcribe things full size, because there really wasn't a way. We take for granted now how easy it is to duplicate, you know, large sort of engineering drawings and, you know, even, you know, in the blueprinting days, you know, it was, but way back when, before big layout cameras and so forth, you had to pretty much either shoot a glass plate of it back in the 1800s or else have a drafter lay a clear piece of drafting paper, or we call it imperial drafting cloth, and trace every part of it. Mm. And that's a lot of what we did to get started. That's a lot of what Kroll did and the Washington Map and Blueprint Company and some of our counterparts that were, and as I mentioned in my quick email, that morphed into cartography.
So if we had to discuss what Kroll Maps was initially in its kind of roots and form, and then what it turns into later, what did it do at first? It did copying for large blueprints and things along those lines. It was doing some base map work for kind of Seattle area, I assume? For
Seattle area, and originally it was the Anderson Map Company, which I believe started in the 1880s. And they also, and then the Washington Map and Blueprint Company, and they would take, every time a survey map, recorded plat was filed in King County or one of the other surrounding counties around Seattle, they, I think, would be able to go up to the courthouse and lay a piece of drafting, somewhat translucent drafting cloth over the original and trace every detail of it, take it back to their shop. And in the very early days, before blueprint machines and so forth, they had these racks where they would take sheets of blueprint paper and put them out in the sun and expose them. Mm-hmm. They would actually go out the windows. And Washington Map and Blueprint Company, we inherited their records. They would also shoot on glass plates copies of these, and you would put, once again, a piece, and it's not the newer ammonia-based blueprint paper that was used in the 50s and 60s and 70s. This was the true water-wash blueprint paper. You put it out in the sun, expose it. And we even I have in our shop here, you know, some of those frames that were used for those and some of the glass plates. Yeah, so they're basically duplications of what the county now has on hand. And 20 years ago, that all went online, and up until the year 2000, we would still have surveyors coming in for copies of these because it was easier to deal with us than the county. So that's just one of the ways our business changed, is that pretty much all went away.
And I imagine this had to have been something that, well, the business, after it goes from Anderson, then a German immigrant, Kroll, begins to...
Who worked for Anderson. He was their drafter.
So he picks up and runs.
And then he bought. Yeah, and he hired my grandfather.
Mm-hmm. And then your grandfather goes on. He continues on the same practices that had been used at the time. Same with your father. And then we come to kind of your era and generation. I would imagine this is a point where things begin to radically shift.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
If I could just go back to one thing, what Kroll and Anderson did some of was not only they acquired these survey maps, but they'd create a bigger picture by doing sort of cadastral or property atlases. And this is something that particularly Kroll really embraced in 1912. He started his first Atlas of Seattle, which was a plat book that would show, you'd open it up, it was 1 inch equals 200 feet, and it would show one section, a equivalent of 1 square mile, show all the parcels of land, all the property dimensions. They would make a guesstimate as to where the house was. My grandfather used to walk the city and try to spot where the house was in relation to primarily fence lines, paste things off, put address, put the type of business it was. And that type of mapping we did for 85, 90 years. And so in my lifetime, it was a very labor-intensive product. But some people might be aware of what are called Sanborn Atlases. Yeah, somewhere along the line, along the line, they got the idea from Sanborn, I believe, to make. And this was the real money maker for them. Is you'd buy the atlas, which was, as I mentioned, very labor-intensive. Hand-colored for showing where the plat boundaries were, and then you'd subscribe to an update service, which would be something you'd paste on the atlas. And Sanborns were primarily for insurance purposes.
Yes.
Ours were more for real estate, city planning, title company use, and so forth. But I want to emphasize the survey record reproduction business was then secondary to this. This was our primary business. On the side, we would do things such as state maps, city street maps, and then when business got really bad, you mentioned in your email the Evergreen Playground. That was started in at the onset of the Great Depression because there was nothing to do. So there's only a couple of maps that are in that, map graphics that are in that sort of style that we ever did.
So what, you obviously were kind of born into the business. It's something that your dad and your grandfather had done. What do you recall about your grandfather? What was he like?
I hardly knew him because he passed away when I was 9. My dad was 53 when I was born, and he was a longtime bachelor. My dad, both of them grew up very poor, and my dad must have done well in school, and he was received a scholarship to Brown University, which was huge for someone from small town Seattle at the time. And then in 1920 got the call from my grandfather saying, I bought a map business, you need to come back and help me run it. So and this is sort of old country mentality, family business. And so to some extent, that applied to me in that you just take over the family business. And I resented that for many years, but I love it. It's just, this has all been good.
That's awesome. But there, for everyone listening, there can be a point in life where decisions are made for you, and it might be obnoxious, but don't despair. Great things can eventually come out of it, for sure. So what was, and your dad, what was he studying when he was at Brown, or was there any affinity from this immediately of dealing with geography?
No.
Okay.
No, he was more into just the general liberal arts and philosophy, and he was a very unique man. But he came back, and I think elements of this business connected with him, and he and his father were really close. And the business grew a lot in the 1920s because Seattle was experiencing some business expansion and so forth, and being recognized as a major port city. Boeing had started up here, so and then the Depression hit. But I think he ended up loving the work as well. There's a certain spirit that goes with a family business that you start to recognize once you get your feet wet.
Indeed. So, is there is there any recollection or anything passed on as to what Kroll himself was like?
Yeah, I remember him. And in fact, we still keep in touch with the Kroll family. I even had the great-granddaughter of Kroll work down here a while.
Oh, my gosh, wow.
Yeah, he lived till his late 90s, and he ended up, as I may have mentioned in my notes, he went back to Germany in 1920 after World War I to help with the Quaker Relief Program, and then came back when things started to change there, but then went to work for Lockheed Shipyards as a drafter. He and my family remained very close through the years, and my last remembrance of him was when we moved out of sort of the old part of downtown Seattle, and there was a man, I thought he was homeless, who was at our storefront because we'd moved up to where the Space Needle is, near the Space Needle in our own building. He was very hard of hearing, but he always used to bring us bags of holly every Christmas. And so I took him and tried to communicate to him that we did not go out of business. But I don't know if he understood.
He got it.
I just grabbed but he was a very close family friend, but he was active until he was very elderly.
And again, everybody, as far as your family, everybody was from Seattle. Everybody was.
That is correct. Yeah, my grandfather was from Austria.
So we get kind of the overall arc of what happens with the business, and the interesting thing that happens with so many family businesses is you could continue on the tradition in a lot of different realms until you get to the 1990s and the early aughts, where you needed to retool and adapt quickly, or else your family business is going to evaporate. And heavens knows, we've seen a lot of small companies that they met that period, they weren't able to be flexible enough, and that was it. They're done.
And then on the other side of the coin, well, that's really, I think, what happened to Metzger Maps, the publisher.
Yes.
Is they did not adapt at the time, but what I credit my dad for not running the business on a shoestring, and he didn't understand the technology, and really going back to the 1980s, hardly anyone did. I remember getting out of college, and this is in the late 70s, and going to it was like an engineering graphics thing in Seattle, and it's the first time I ever saw a pen plotter, and it really is, very similar to robotics. It's but it drew beautiful curves and arcs and circles and lettering, and so at that point in time you could see the writing on the wall. Well, in 1987, somehow my dad was able to fork out the money for a CAD workstation, and
oh my God,
yeah, and so that's really where we got our start. It was before the term GIS was prevalent, and they referred to it as automated mapping or automated mapping facilities management. And so we weren't really able to take that anywhere at the time, but, that was a necessary series of steps where we would take our lumps learning the technology and growing from there. Yeah.
So at least when the deep end of the pool came to you, at least your dad said, I think we're going to have to get in this at some point. And so literally
he had
made the
no
investment.
idea. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so, but he recognized that it was going to change.
Wow. That's vision. That's amazing vision. And so if we had to describe what you do now in business, what's kind of the scope of what Kroll is about?
Well, we do a lot. Most of our work is custom mapping, and we have a day-to-day relationship with the Metzger map retail outlet in the Pike Place Market, which is extraordinarily popular. And people will go there, and we've replicated basically all four levels of our old historic hand-drawn mapping, and it's all in real-world coordinates. So people will go in there and want sort of custom coverages, or they'll go in there or here and request certain elements of their own information, maybe from a spreadsheet that has some sort of spatial data, whether it's address, latitude, longitude, zip codes, whatever. And we've gotten pretty good at incorporating that type of information into our mapping and making a lot of the necessary decisions to illustrate what the client wants.
Wow. Okay. So there's pretty quick adaptation then that you guys have made in order to.
Well, I would say it was a progression, and that
Okay.
I don't want to get technical here, but what we did initially in the early 90s is we took, one thing that was a game changer for us is we bought a large format scanner.
Oh yeah.
And I can't. It's hard for me to describe the. In some ways, it was relief, excitement, whatever, to see these old maps that were with so much work put into them. The old original tracings show up on a computer screen with ease, and this would have been maybe starting in maybe 93 or so. Prior to that point, it was what they call the vector world, where you had to enter things with coordinate and geometry and so forth. But here, to see these maps, and then you could print them out, any scale and so forth, that was one level. The next level was to create continuous coverages, and then to move them into a coordinate system. We took a lot of those old maps and actually gave them coordinate values. The accuracy had limitations, so the final step with all this was where we are now, and that's to recreate them in what we call the vector world, where using a lot of public domain data to do this, where everything will match, so we can then bring in aerial photographs, you name it. It's really magical on my end.
Yeah. No, we've likewise, in a small way, experienced the moment of wonder and like the sense of a frontier. As soon as it's hard to explain, but after you've dealt with something for a long time, to see it scanned in and to be so faithfully true, and you could slap it on any screen. There's something that's like so liberating that, we've in a small way felt that. When it came to the scope of Kroll Maps, I know you guys did work, literally, really articulate work for Alaska, and you did stuff all the way down. I know there's plenty of stuff that covers Oregon and such too. Was it indeed Pacific Northwest or all West Coast? What was kind of the scope?
Of our standard maps primarily, but we did a map in World War II. It's the North Pacific map. I even uncovered a map that Kroll did, in which we have on hand now. It's a paper copy of a map he drew of Europe. And here's an example of custom mapping way back. It was a base map, and it showed the progress of the Germany advancing, and it was all hand colored. So it was sponsored by a bank here, and so the bank would give them out to people with these colored revisions showing the progress of Germany against France and England, and so they would end up doing things like that, and we'd take on custom work on occasion, doing things from scratch. And we do now. We have maps where we've created for like the African Development Bank and the Gates Foundation of other parts of the globe.
Wow.
Usually communicating, these are not maps you would sell at a retail store like Metzger, but usually communicating specific themes.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. Okay. Jumping back to when it came to kind of that war era, depression era, you'd mentioned Evergreen Playground, and that's typically when we've seen other little bird's eye views that you did for Seattle. I can think of two different perspectives, actually. Was all of that just kind of, trying to feel out new space, didn't have much on the docket to do, so you were trying to expand and try and get new grasp on things? Were there artists in particular you contacted, or was it in-house?
Oh, that was all done in-house. And
wow.
Part of it, like that Evergreen Playground, which there's been a couple of different versions of that, which basically ended in the late 1950s. It was work that we could do that expressed a passion for the area, because there's a statement in the title block that we borrowed from, I think he was an explorer, Lord Bryce, that neither Europe nor Asia nor South America has a landscape in which mountains and I can't remember the whole. I don't have it in front of me. Are so united in a landscape. So, and I know my grandfather and my dad and our head drafter here for 60 years, Ed Poland, all loved the mountains in particular. So that's I think characterized very well on that graphic.
Yeah, that's something about Evergreen. The image for Evergreen Playground is it very much conveys an indigenous understanding and an appreciation for it. There's something that's conveyed that it's home in the most beatific sense. It's home. Yeah.
And it's had a second life. We through the Metzger store we sell that in various sizes, and people have really embraced it as a unique homegrown graphic.
Yep.
And I do know, just as an aside, how it was created, and that I still have the camera here. It's an 8x10 camera. They took a state map, and we had a copy board that would tilt. So they tilted that, and in order to get the outline, it distorts it greatly just to get that perspective, and then use that as the base for adding all the other information.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't necessarily a wholly conceived bird's eye view type thing, but they actually had a base that they just tilted in order to get that kind of foreshortening. That's interesting.
Yeah, that oblique view.
Yeah, the darn. That's cool.
Yeah.
So how many years have you done this?
I started when I was 11. I'm 65 now, and I started sweeping and cleaning toilets. And I still do that, and it's just a small business. But I really got started on a regular basis in the business in 1970. And I started by doing some deliveries and then driving people around when they would do field work, like check the addresses on the plat books, and then I started running blueprint machines. I would do. A lot of people probably aren't familiar with like pre-press work. We had some maps lithographed and like pin registration and different overlays that would go into making map layout photography. All that, I did that, and I wore a shop apron here up until I was probably 35 every day.
Wow! Wow!
Yeah.
So you've known every facet inside out of the business. You've done it thousands of times yourself.
Except the hand drafting. I never did the hand drafting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Out of all the years, are there any outstanding jobs or customers that kind of still kind of resonate with you, or still kind of, wow, I can't believe we did that? You'd mentioned Gates and some other folks that you had done.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting. Here's another scenario is that they, I believe, went down to the Metzger store. They wanted a map of Ethiopia that shows tribal boundaries, which I believe are called Woraitis boundaries. And so they came here asking us, because we'd done, we have a very talented head cartographer, Maria Brown, who had done a slew of maps for the African Development Bank, dozens or hundreds, I can't even remember how many, showing all types of different information. And so we were able to show them these maps, and it was obvious we were qualified to do the work. So the problem was getting the tribal boundaries, because you can assemble, there's a lot of geographic spatial data you can use for free, and one great resource is called Natural Earth Data, which we use for jobs like this. So, but the problem was these tribal boundaries, and so this is the part I enjoy a lot, is doing sort of data mining. And so I ended up finding these and getting permission through the United Nations in Geneva. They had a spatial file that had these boundaries on them. But what a lot of cartographers would understand is the problem of meshing data, especially since there are especially boundary data that might have had the boundaries might have been digitized from another source and so forth. So you have to recognize things don't always mesh. It's what they call map mashing now. And so we are still able to put together a very good piece, but also then once this is done, we were asked to do some analysis. They would give us a spreadsheet and represent which tribal boundaries are represented by, like, UNICEF or PATH, and so those type of jobs are very interesting. But we get an assortment of people back here. One of the instances I remember most clearly was when we had two KGB agents come in here in the early 1980s, and I helped them. So it's like two gentlemen out of a James Bond movie, the bad guy.
No, sir. Complete with the thick accent, and they want complete set of maps for all of your city and the U.S.
Yeah, and they had and then shortly after they left, the FBI came in. So,
oh my gosh! Wow.
Yeah, so that was our brief encounter with international intrigue.
That's amazing. I was going to ask too on the shift and change end of things. We've talked with a lot of different small local map makers. One of the things that kind of caught me was talking with a small company that was actually based here regionally, and they said at one point one of the large tech companies, who everybody would recognize the name, came in and bought one of each. And it became clear that this was them laying the foundation for what would be their ubiquitous mapping service that would come up in the next decade. Did you also end up supplying, do you believe, things for those kind of services?
To some extent, there was a company that came to us and actually paid us.
Okay.
It's been almost 30 years to reference our addressing information on our maps, because the way copyright is now, you cannot copyright a fact, and an address is a fact, but also they recognize as a courtesy that it represents an enormous amount of work to drive around and get each and every address for a metropolitan area.
Oh, gosh.
So we did reach an agreement, and I'm sure there was an instance where King County, our local government, was digitizing off our plat books, and we didn't end up. So we just asked them to stop and recognize and acknowledge us.
Okay. Yeah, that was there was kind of a Wild West feeling to when things were changing over into a digital world. And I'm afraid that was it was a lot of time that a lot of people's work, just whole cloth, was absorbed. No statements made. It was just, well, that's it. It's ours. And that was the end of the discussion. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we were, and that may have happened to some extent, but we were determined to carve a path and had a really strong clientele that we serviced at the time, and a lot of it for custom mapping, like the real estate companies we dealt with and so forth. They came to us not only for our maps, but for our service and our ability to understand their needs, because a lot of times we were creating a specific communication tool, whether it was trying to attract someone to lease space in a shopping center, or showing zip codes of economic growth where you'd want to put a new subdivision, those type of things. So those are kind of cut and dry map graphics, but it's a lot of that's been our bread and butter. And we got quite good at cutting to the core of what people need in that regard.
Yeah. So I should have asked, do you have kids yourself?
Yeah.
Okay. Are they at all interested, or are they apprehensive of the family business?
Well, I have a daughter that isn't. I don't think she's in the Bay Area, and I have a son up in Fort Collins that he's worked some in the Metzger store, the retail part of it. He likes it, but I just, from where I sit, I just cannot tell him what to do with his life. I was sort of told that, although if I had been smart enough or motivated enough to say, hey, I want to go to medical school, my dad would have listened to that, but I wasn't, like a lot of other young boys. And so I want him to find his way, and he could end up here. If none of our family wants to get involved, I still want these to carry on in some way, shape, or form as businesses that have, a deep-rooted historical connection to this city and this area. And I don't see any reason why I can't make that work if none of our family members get involved.
Yeah. No, that is perfectly put, because I think that's one thing that people don't appreciate perhaps at the moment is a lot of these small map companies were so intertwined with regional history, you can't do one without the other.
Right.
Especially in early 20th century in the West, where there's so much growth and change. That
Right.
just as you discussed the whole thing of like, well, you have to have really articulate jobs that you kind of have to handhold and walk through for what the customer needs. In the some way, you end up becoming a part of the warp and woof of how a city develops.
Yeah, and in the case you mentioned, how we did maps in Alaska, is that that really started with the gold rush here in Anderson Map Company.
All the way back to, okay. Wow.
Yeah, and so we have some of their originals, tracings and so forth of the maps that they used back in the late 1800s at the peak of that, 1984.
Wow. When did your dad pass?
He passed away in 1995.
Okay, so a little while back.
Yeah.
What was he like as far as, I not to get ultra personal, but I'm just kind of curious.
Uh-huh.
The more I sat and looked at the images and everything else, he kind of struck me as mild-mannered, energized, really could kind of sync with people and get what they needed to get done, kind of person.
He was very gruff.
Was he? Okay.
He could be, and then he was a product of the Depression, and so he was really conservative, and that made a deep imprint on him. I had, besides Ed Poland, who was our head drafter for 60 years, that's another story. I also worked with a family friend named Sherman Sloan, who was an ex-Marine, World War II sergeant, who was, really ran us all through the hoops. He was very strict, but I benefited from that.
Wow. Yeah, I have to say, I could kind of see that. It does hit me too. The older generation, your father's era, etc., there was kind of a can-do, I can do anything, almost kind of frontiersman kind of quality to their skill sets, where it's like he could fix the car, he could go build you a house, he could take down a tree. He was great at fishing, he was great at hunting. It was kind of like they were extremely well-rounded, and you realize that's all because of the environment in some ways, that the time frame they came from and the environment.
And what he also recognized was some of the elements of what we were doing when he was in his 20s, back in the 1920s, transcended technology, like good information, use of typefaces, all those things, and representation at adequate scales, all that. So that still plays a role in our mindset now.
Wow. Yeah, those are the invaluable big picture kind of macro understandings of things. Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Gosh, John, thank you so much for letting me burn up an hour of your time. Our thanks to John Loacker for a chance to chat and learn more. He can be reached at krollmapcompany.com. Please feel free to contact us here at New Projections with any questions or requests at newprojectionscast@gmail.com. Catch you next time.